It was a chilly evening in New York City, the kind where the streets sparkled with the glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. The upscale restaurant, Le Bernardin, was buzzing with its usual mix of well-dressed patrons, businessmen closing deals over wine, couples celebrating anniversaries, and tourists hoping to experience fine dining in one of Manhattan's most famous spots. 17-year-old Barron Trump walked in alone, dressed casually in a navy blue hoodie and jeans, his tall frame making him stand out even more. He wasn't flashy, didn't make a scene, just a young man looking for a quiet meal. Despite growing up in the spotlight, Barron had always preferred staying out of it. As he approached the host stand, the maitre d' greeted him politely, but the waiter assigned to his section, a middle-aged man named Greg Sullivan, gave a disapproving glance. Greg had strong opinions about the Trump family, and seeing Barron walk in triggered something in him. "Table for one?" the maitre d' asked, his tone professional. "Yes, please," Barron replied with a small nod. The maitre d' led him to a corner table by the window. The restaurant was busy, but it wasn't packed. Plenty of tables available. Still, Greg hesitated before approaching. He didn't want to serve him. In his mind, Barron was just another spoiled rich kid who had never worked a day in his life. After a few minutes, Barron, still waiting, glanced around. Other tables were getting menus, water, bread. He? Nothing. Finally, he caught Greg's eye. "Excuse me," Barron said politely. "Could I get a menu?" Greg crossed his arms. "Are you sure you can afford to eat here?" Barron blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Greg sighed dramatically, picking up a menu from a nearby table and slapping it down in front of him. "Listen, kid, this isn't some fast food joint. We don't do special treatment here." Barron frowned but kept his composure. "I wasn't asking for special treatment, just regular service." Greg smirked. "Yeah, well, I have other tables to attend to. You can wait." Barron wasn't used to this kind of hostility. Growing up, his parents had always told him to be kind, to treat people with respect, no matter who they were. He wasn't expecting the same from everyone, but this was different. Still, he stayed quiet. Causing a scene wasn't his style. He could have left, could have called the manager, could have even mentioned his last name and changed Greg's attitude in an instant, but he didn't. Instead, he simply sat there waiting. Then, the restaurant doors swung open. A familiar figure stepped inside, her long coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, her presence commanding yet graceful. Melania Trump had arrived. The moment Melania Trump stepped inside Le Bernardin, heads turned. Even in a city where celebrities and high-profile figures were a common sight, she carried an air of quiet elegance that made people take notice. Dressed in a cream-colored wool coat over a fitted dress, she looked effortlessly poised, her sharp eyes scanning the restaurant. Barron, seated by the window, sighed in relief when he saw her. He hadn't called her. His mother just had a way of knowing when something was wrong. She walked straight toward him, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. As she reached his table, she gave him a gentle smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't tell me you were coming here," she said in her soft Slovenian accented voice. Barron smiled slightly. "Didn't think I needed a reservation to eat alone." Melania's eyes flickered over the table. No water, no bread, no sign of service. Her gaze sharpened. She had been in enough high-end restaurants to know this wasn't a mistake. Someone had deliberately ignored her son. Just then, Greg, the waiter, walked by again. He froze mid-step when he saw Melania. Recognition flashed in his eyes, and for a split second he looked uncomfortable. But then, his expression hardened, and he forced a polite smile. "Mrs. Trump," he said, his voice suddenly more controlled. "Didn't realize you'd be joining us." Melania's eyes didn't waver. "I was wondering why my son has been sitting here for so long without service." Her tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Greg shrugged, trying to act indifferent. "We've been busy tonight." Melania glanced around. Other tables were receiving their meals, wine glasses being refilled, waiters moving efficiently from one patron to another. The restaurant was lively, but it wasn't chaotic. She looked back at Greg. "Busy?" she repeated. "Yet I see other tables taken care of." Greg forced a tight smile. "Well, we have to prioritize our regular guests." Barron, still seated, could feel the tension thickening. He knew his mother. She wasn't the type to yell or create a scene, but she had a way of making people feel small without raising her voice. Melania didn't blink. "So, my son, who came here alone, politely asked for service and has been ignored, he is not worthy of being a guest?" Greg hesitated, but before he could speak, another voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" The restaurant manager, a middle-aged woman named Linda Morales, had noticed the exchange from across the room and hurried over. She was professional, and experienced enough to sense when something was going terribly wrong. Melania turned to her. Yes, my son has been sitting here without service while others around him have been helped. Your waiter tells me it is because you are busy. Linda's face paled slightly. She knew what this meant. This was bad. She turned to Greg. Is that true? Greg hesitated again, as if debating whether to stand his ground. Then with a sigh, he muttered, I didn't think he was serious about dining here. Silence. Linda looked horrified. Murmurs started among the surrounding tables. People who had been casually watching the exchange now fully tuned in. Melania exhaled softly, then took a seat across from Barron, her movements deliberate. She folded her hands neatly on the table. Then, looking directly at Linda, she said, I believe we are ready to order now. A tense silence hung in the air as Linda, the restaurant manager, shot Greg a warning look before turning back to Melania. Of course, Mrs. Trump, Linda said quickly, her voice professional but slightly strained. I deeply apologize for the poor service. I'll personally take your order. Greg scoffed under his breath, but he knew better than to argue in front of his boss. Still, the irritation in his eyes was obvious. He didn't want to serve Barron, and now he had to watch his manager step in to fix his mess. Melania nodded slightly, then glanced at Barron. Would you like to order first, sweetheart? Barron hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to moments like this, where people's prejudices were so blatantly obvious. Sure, he knew his family was controversial, but he had never thrown his last name around to get special treatment. He never wanted to. But this situation wasn't about privilege. It was about basic decency. I'll have the pan-seared salmon, Barron said finally, his voice calm but firm. Melania turned back to Linda. And I will have the Dover sole, please. Linda jotted it down quickly. Excellent choices. I'll make sure it's prepared right away. She forced a tight smile, then gave Greg one last glare before hurrying toward the kitchen. Greg, meanwhile, stayed frozen in place for a second before finally muttering, I'll get your water. He walked off stiffly, his pride clearly wounded. As soon as he was gone, Barron exhaled and leaned back in his chair. You didn't have to do that, he said, looking at his mother. Melania tilted her head. And let someone disrespect you? Her voice was gentle but firm. No, Barron, that is not how we allow people to treat us. Barron played with the edge of his napkin. I wasn't trying to make a scene. Melania smiled softly. You did not. I did. Barron looked out the window for a moment, watching the city outside. The streets of New York had always been fast-moving, ruthless, and unpredictable. He had grown up in this city but never felt fully a part of it. Now he was starting to see a side of it that wasn't just about business meetings and high-end restaurants. It was about how people treated each other when they thought no one was watching. People judge, Melania continued, breaking the silence. They assume, they label. It is easy to look at someone and think you know their story. But kindness is a choice. Barron turned back to her, seeing something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, a quiet understanding. She had experienced this before, not in the same way, but she knew what it was like to be judged unfairly. Greg returned a minute later, setting down 2 glasses of water with a clink. His movements were stiff, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word before walking away again. Barron took a sip of his water, then smirked slightly. I don't think he's going to be our biggest fan. Melania let out a soft chuckle. That is his choice. Ours is how we respond. At that moment, Linda returned with a complimentary bread basket, setting it down with an apologetic smile. This is on the house. Again, I'm very sorry for the experience. Please let me know if you need anything else. Melania gave a small nod of appreciation, but before Linda could leave, Barron spoke. Can I ask you something? Linda paused. Of course. Barron glanced toward Greg, who was now attending to another table, his demeanor much more pleasant. Has he always been like that? Linda hesitated, then sighed. Greg has worked here for years. He's opinionated. She carefully chose her words, but that doesn't excuse what happened tonight. Barron nodded, considering her response. I get that people have opinions, he said after a moment, but I don't get why it has to come at the expense of basic decency. Linda gave him a long, thoughtful look before responding. Neither do I. Then with a final nod, she excused herself. Melania reached for a piece of bread and handed one to Barron. Eat, she said with a small smile. Food tastes better when you don't let people ruin your appetite. Barron took it, chewing thoughtfully. He wasn't angry anymore, just thoughtful. Tonight had shown him something he wouldn't forget anytime soon, and he had a feeling this wasn't over yet. Dinner arrived not long after, steaming plates of perfectly prepared seafood placed delicately in front of them. The scent of butter and fresh herbs filled the air, but the tension from earlier still lingered at the edges of the evening. As Barron picked up his fork, He noticed Greg hovering at another table, talking and laughing with guests as if nothing had happened. The stark contrast between his cold demeanor toward Barron and his warmth toward others wasn't lost on him. Melania, however, had moved on. She ate gracefully, unfazed, as if nothing could shake her. Barron envied that. "You seem unbothered," he finally said, pushing a piece of salmon around his plate. She took a sip of her water before responding. "I have dealt with worse." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Melania's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You think people were kind to me when I first came to this country? A woman with an accent? Modeling for a living?" She shook her head. "People assumed many things. I learned not to let their opinions define me." Barron considered her words. He had grown up in privilege, yes, but that privilege had come with its own set of assumptions. Some people despised him without ever knowing him. Others idolized him for the same reason. Either way, neither group saw him. Just then, Greg passed by their table again, collecting empty dishes from a nearby couple. As he walked past, Barron caught his eye. This time, instead of looking away, Greg met his gaze, but only for a second before quickly turning his back. Barron had seen that look before. It wasn't just dislike, it was discomfort. Without really thinking, Barron set down his fork and stood up. Melania looked at him curiously. "Where are you going?" Barron didn't answer immediately. He made his way toward the small station near the kitchen where Greg had retreated to stack plates. Greg glanced up, clearly caught off guard. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone not as sharp as before, but still edged with irritation. Barron hesitated for a second, then said, "I just wanted to ask, why?" Greg frowned. "Why what? Why treat me differently? You don't know me." Greg let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't need to know you." He shook his head and picked up a cloth to wipe the counter. "Look, kid, you have no idea what it's like for people like me. People who work every day, struggle to pay rent, deal with real problems while guys like your father sit in golden towers." Barron's jaw tightened. He expected some kind of personal grudge, but this was something else entirely. "I'm not my father," Barron said evenly. Greg scoffed. "Yeah? And yet here you are, eating in a place most people couldn't afford in a lifetime." He gestured around the restaurant. "Guys like you get everything handed to you. Guys like me serve it." Barron didn't flinch. He understood resentment, but he also knew that Greg had decided who he was before he ever spoke a word to him. "Do you really think that's all people are?" Barron asked. "What they were born into?" Greg stopped wiping and looked at him for the first time. Really looked at him. He seemed ready to fire back, but something in Barron's expression stopped him. After a long pause, Greg exhaled sharply and muttered, "Enjoy your meal." Then, without another word, he walked away. Barron stood there for a moment before heading back to his table. When he sat down, Melania gave him a knowing glance. "What did he say?" she asked. Barron picked up his fork again and sighed. "That I don't understand people like him." Melania took a slow sip of her water before responding. "Perhaps he does not understand you either." Barron thought about that as he took another bite of his salmon. For the first time that night, it actually tasted good. The tension had settled, but it wasn't entirely gone. As Barron continued eating, his mind kept replaying Greg's words. "Guys like you get everything handed to you. Guys like me serve it." He had heard similar things before. Whispers online, strangers in public places who muttered under their breath, assumptions about his life just because of his last name. But tonight, it felt different, more personal. Melania, ever composed, finished her meal without another word on the matter, but she was watching him, reading the thoughts swirling in his head the way only a mother could. As the plates were cleared, Linda, the manager, returned, looking a little hesitant. "Is everything to your liking?" she asked, clearly wanting to smooth things over. "Yes, thank you," Melania replied politely. Barron nodded, but then glanced toward the back of the restaurant where Greg had disappeared again. "Can I ask you something?" Linda hesitated. "Of course." Barron leaned forward. "Does Greg always act like this? Or was it just because of me?" Linda sighed, glancing down as if debating how much she should say. "Greg is a good worker," she admitted, "but he has strong feelings about certain things." She hesitated before adding, "He's had a tough year. His brother lost his job, and his mother's been sick. I think he carries a lot of anger about the world, and sometimes, unfortunately, he takes it out on the wrong people." Barron absorbed this. He wasn't excusing Greg's behavior, but for the first time that night, he saw more than just a rude waiter. He saw a man who was struggling. Melania, still listening, finally spoke. "Everyone has struggles," she said. "That does not give them the right to treat others poorly." Linda nodded quickly. "Of course, and I'll be having a serious talk with him. This isn't how we do things here." Barron, however, had a different thought. Can I talk to him again? Melania raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Barron nodded. Yeah. Linda looked surprised but gestured toward the back. He's in the staff area. I can call him out. A few minutes later, Greg emerged, his expression guarded. He clearly wasn't expecting another conversation. What now? He asked, his tone laced with exhaustion. Barron didn't react to the attitude. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something, a folded $100 bill. He set it down on the table between them. Greg's eyes narrowed. I don't need your money. It's not a handout, Barron said. It's a tip. Greg let out a dry laugh. For what? Ignoring you all night? Barron shook his head. For the work you do every day. For your mom. For whatever you need it for. He met Greg's eyes. Not because of my last name, just because I can. Greg stared at the bill, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally he exhaled, and some of the sharpness in his face faded. You didn't have to do that, he muttered. Barron shrugged. Neither did you. Greg looked down again, then, reluctantly, picked up the money and tucked it into his apron. He didn't say thank you, not yet, but his voice was quieter when he finally spoke. Enjoy the rest of your night, kid. As he walked away, Melania gave Barron a long, thoughtful look. That was kind of you, she said simply. Barron sipped his water. Like you said, he murmured. Kindness is a choice, and tonight he had made his. As Barron and Melania finished their meal, the tension that had clouded the evening slowly lifted. The atmosphere in Le Bernardin returned to normal. Clinking glasses, soft conversations, the hum of New York life moving forward. But for Barron, something had shifted. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even upset. He just felt aware of how easily people judged, how pain and resentment could shape a person, and how a single act of kindness, however small, could change the course of a night. Linda returned once more, this time with the bill in hand. Again, I really appreciate your patience tonight, she said, her voice genuine. Melania took the check and pulled out her wallet, but Barron reached for it first. I got it, he said. Melania glanced at him, surprised, but didn't argue. She watched as he added a generous tip, more than what was customary, not just for the service, but for the lesson he had walked away with. Linda hesitated. Are you sure? Barron nodded. Yeah, I'm sure. She smiled. Thank you, Mr. Trump. And for what it's worth, not everyone assumes the worst about you. Barron smirked. Good to know. As they stood to leave, Greg was wiping down a table across the room. He noticed them, his posture stiffening for a brief second. But then, just as they reached the door, he did something unexpected. He gave a small nod. Not quite an apology, not quite gratitude, but an acknowledgement. Barron returned the nod before stepping outside into the crisp New York air. The city stretched out before them, glowing in the night. The sounds of car horns and distant laughter filled the streets, a reminder that the world moved on, regardless of what happened inside a single restaurant. Melania looped her arm through Barron's as they started walking toward their car. You handled yourself well tonight, she said softly. Barron exhaled, looking up at the city skyline. I don't think I changed his mind about me. Melania smiled knowingly. Maybe not, but you reminded him that people are more than just their names. Barron thought about that, letting her words settle. Maybe she was right. Maybe kindness wasn't about proving people wrong, but showing them something different, something better. As they got into the car and drove off, Barron took one last look at the restaurant fading into the distance. Tonight had been unexpected, but it was a night he wouldn't forget. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can leave the biggest impact. In a world where judgment comes easily, choosing humanity over hate is what truly defines us. What would you have done in Barron's place? Share your thoughts below.